listening to the Clear Pill Podcast, now sponsored by Miller Lite. If you like the show, check us out on Spotify, Apple Music, and Patreon. Thanks for listening.
So today we're talking about Capitalist Realism, a book by English professor Mark Fisher, published in 2009 following the financial crisis. Fisher does something pretty interesting for me in this book because capitalist realism is sort of a philosophy and a commentary on the present. He speaks openly and directly from his vantage point as a professor about changes within the student body and the administrative body, changes that he feels are echoed throughout various industries and threads of life. The boldest claim in capitalist realism is that mental illness is primarily the cause of socioeconomic conditions. And as a historical factor of life, mental illness has been exacerbated on what he calls post-Ford, post-history, or postmodern capitalism. Reference to Frederick Jameson here. His evidence begins in the way that society localizes sickness, and by extension, addiction, which is the likely outcome for those who suffer mental problems, to the individual in an effort to remove the burden from the state. He cites the $15 billion pharmaceutical industry as evidence of its financial benefits. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family behind it agreed to an $8 billion settlement that includes a $2 billion criminal forfeiture, a $3.5 billion criminal fine, and $2.8 billion in damages for its criminal liability in misleading the public on the dangers of opioids and the high probability for its abuse and addiction. There's a depoliticization of depression in its localization to the individual. The result is that people fail to connect the two, capitalism and depression, and the imagination of the individual suffers, particularly in its capacity to envision new societies. The resulting vacuum is filled by what Fisher calls capitalist realism. This idea that capitalism is all that there is, that the present road is the only road. As Fisher says in his own words, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. There's a cultural impact as well, this feeling of malaise, that there is nothing new, something we can all relate to in the climate of COVID, where even the reboot is forced into rerun as film productions are drawn to a halt and lived experiences recline to one's living room. In the place of alternatives and imagination, we have the politics of disavowal that perform the job of anti-capitalism for us. The sense that while capitalism is bad, if we buy the right products, we can solve its problems. One is immediately brought to what Foucault calls the visual of the confessional, the archetype of Christian society carried through to our own. But there is also the tendency towards nostalgia, in conjuring previous realities and in pursuing lost futures. Here he would most definitely like us to consider the way protest tends towards the signifiers of the 60s. It's been over a decade now since its publication. I'm curious what you guys thought of the book, its relevancy now, considering the rise of nationalism, conspiracy, and protest movements like Occupy and BLM.
Yeah, thank you so much for that opening. That was awesome. I think that, Mark Fisher was a figure who drew from a lot of different sources and from a really sort of multidisciplinary group of people in terms of his references, the philosophers he was looking towards and the sorts of academics he was thinking about. But something that I think I really appreciate about Mark Fisher is his ability to sort of step outside of academia too, and to take these ideas and turn it into something which we experience, on a day-to-day basis. I think his critique of popular culture, but also just, reckoning with it is something that can really connect to a lot of different people. And it's not something that just exists inside the ivory towers. So I really appreciate that about his work.
Yeah, I think that this book kind of looms large in terms of it informing an entire generation on their contemporary circumstances. And reading it for the first time, even though I'm fairly familiar with some of the references and the ideas that it brings up, it really reads as a common sense, especially of the early 2010s, about what social conditions and future prospects were faced with. And it's really striking to note its influence. Nick Land, of course, is also a prominent figure that comes out of a similar trajectory to Mark Fisher. They both worked at the University of Warwick in the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which was an extremely influential institution for kind of thinking about the emergence of neoliberal capitalism and how it was changing culture in the age of information technologies and their growing pervasiveness. So yeah, I think it's a touchstone that, you know, we really have to reckon with in the kind of as we move potentially out of that paradigm, or whether we think that it's still just as prescient as it always was.
You mentioned Nick Land. I think that Mark Fisher was one of the founding members of the Cybernetics Institute. So the Cybernetics Institute at Warwick came up with a lot of the sort of cyber theory and theory about, you know, capitalism, accelerated capitalism. And I think that you also see that in a lot of Mark Fisher's work, that influence is totally there just in terms of how he thinks about social media.
I'm curious what you guys think of this, especially because you guys went to school in England. It seems like you guys probably have like firsthand experience, I guess, into like a lot of the changes and like the climate of education that he speaks to, because he really gets into the student body a lot too, which I thought was interesting and pretty unique. With regards of just talking to the education system. You know, typically criticism is always thrown and levied at like the administration. But I really liked when he kind of goes on to this like kind of neuroses of like youth today and like of his students. You know, he describes this one kid who, I mean, I remember seeing this shit in high school. Just like the dude who has one headphone in the ear.
Oh yeah, that was me. I definitely had that dangle going. Yeah.
Yeah. The dangle gig, and I think that's such like an awesome. I think he has this very cynical perception of things, very much kind of like this intergenerational gap, or that's the impression that I get at least. And I think some of this stuff is a little bit misconstrued, but I found it particularly just pretty interesting that he talks about, you know, the youth generation now that ADHD is sort of the internal mental condition of late capitalism, of present day society. His students say that, you know, they don't want to read Nietzsche because Nietzsche's boring. And his point, his rebuttal is that it's not that Nietzsche is boring, is that like Nietzsche is like, the point is that it's complex. The point is that it's difficult, and you need to have the attention to overcome that. And he talks about sort of this like soft neuroses of his students, or just youth culture being addicted to like fast food and smoking pot and kind of just losing this what he calls this like temporal sense of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something owed to Frederick Jameson, who he references heavily, about the temporality of late stage capitalism, about the acceleration of trade and the movement of goods and labor that has a kind of corollary in culture where ideas, images are shared with such a accelerated fervor that it has really detrimental effects on mental health. And like you're saying, ADHD being the paradigmatic example of like the mental crisis of our time and an inability to focus. But yeah, I think it is definitely a text that comes out of an experience of higher education in the United Kingdom, and I appreciate that he kind of leans into almost a biographical story of his experience with the students, and I found it to, still be very true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because his argument also has this sort of, it's like, I don't know how to put it, two sides of the same coin, let's just say, where he also says that, I think he really advocates for adding a more sort of libidinal nature to culture to, really just turn over like a new leaf, create novel content that makes people excited. And part of that I think he advocates, he says it's not necessarily doomed in terms of its medium. It's not social media, it's not mainstream media, which necessitates for things to be repetitive. It's really capitalism, in that I think he still points to this idea that there's still potential to create libidinal content.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The experience of reading the book is definitely different cascades of, depressive analysis about the way that we're ensconced within different forms of control. But I think one of the hopeful points that he makes is that he really centers the 1968 youth radical movements that challenged capitalism, and he points to how their demands were related to the unleashing of desire and the kind of importance that they put on breaking out of the industrial Fordist mode of production, where people were, in the same line of work for 40 years, and that the new forms of capitalism and exploitation that we face gave to the generation of 1968 an ability to actually embrace desire and go and achieve kind of what they wanted in the realm of culture, but then at the end of the day didn't give them other forms of solidarity and the ability to, socially reproduce. And so, like, how can we address the things that are lacking with that, and like be aware of what was successful about those youth movements and then what was recuperated by capitalism.
Yeah, he kind of avoids this problem that happens to a lot of philosophers, what Rick Roderick calls the paradox of the cynic, where somebody describes like a situation so gloomy, like people are so heavily indoctrinated that there's almost no way out. And that's definitely the feeling and the sentiment that I get reading a lot of, French thinkers, particularly out of that post-left, post-60s world, where but Fisher is really incredible at I think not only providing a materialist analysis, an analysis that draws upon a lot of disciplines, but also one that is incredibly cynical while simultaneously sketching out at the end of the book some I think some rough proposals about some new ways in which capitalism can be confronted. I'm not sure the validity of those. I think a lot has changed in the last 10 years. There's a lot of popular experiences which we can draw from. But one thing that I really liked is from the book that he returns to a lot is this kind of this politics of disavowing something. To me really cracks me up, because as soon as I read that chapter, I started walking down just like this major street next to where I live. And there's all these businesses that consistently like flaunder that, they're GMO free, that everything is fair source, and it's gotten to the point that it's even at like a McDonald's, like the liberal hellhole has become like inverted, where now they even project that like everything is locally sourced and fair trade. And it's like this like disavowment of like the negative consequences of capitalism is the same thing as actually doing something about it. So for Fisher, and I think for Jameson as well, there's this the present like I guess, culture or sentiment within capitalism is that we don't even have to do anything. Capitalism will be anti-capitalism for us. And he uses Wall-E as sort of the classic example of this. Is like the spectators in the audience are really the ones that are being spoofed on in the movie, you know?
Yeah, I think that he is usefully cynical, right? And his cynicism is justified. Where you pointed to a few moments, I would add to it that, you know, some of my favorites are his criticisms of music. Like, I think that his support of bands like Death Grips and Burial, who, you know, if they sample or harken back to content which has been well treaded, it's in a way to sort of reveal the emptiness of music and the genres. So I think that's really cool. Like, I feel like, you know, some of the musicians he would probably like today are, you know, sort of young lean adjacent.
No,
Like, sort of
all of it.
sad in the club.
Yeah, and his I guess work on the music industry and music at large got me thinking about just how people don't listen to albums anymore. Like, we live in a consumer society that's addicted to the single now, precisely because there isn't this attention span or like depth of listening, where now it's just like, you know, I recently did a job for the manager of The Weeknd, and this guy was actually talking about this. He was saying, you know, if I don't hear a song that doesn't have its hook or its chorus in the first 30 seconds, that I won't sign that band and I won't like produce that song. And it's because he recognizes that it's not profitable. People don't have the attention span like longer than 30 minutes. So you need to be constantly like pumping out fucking serotonin. Otherwise, you're not going to make any money.
Yeah, I think certainly music is the best example, maybe, of what Mark Fisher is talking about. It makes a lot of sense that he uses it. I mean, these 3-minute clips in the music industry is just so vapid. At least I say that from afar. But just the lack of sort of good critique of music anymore. I mean, you look at Pitchfork and, you know, Fader. I think, you know, Mark Fisher was one of the last great music critics.
Well, there's going to be some great musical criticism coming out of our new website, Tiki Torch. Go and check it out.
Yeah, the other side of the aisle of Pitchfork.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. all voices matter. Come on, guys.
We're actually completely firewalled from Pitchfork. We don't talk about any musicians they talk about. Yeah, I think, you know, the other side of Mark Fisher's argument, which you touched upon in your opening, is the conversation about the pharmaceutical industry and about mental health, which is not something I had ever thought about in that way before.
Yeah, I mean, he basically says that the present moment denies the possibility of like a social causation for mental health, which I think, yeah, is definitely the pharmaceutical company's wet dream.
Yeah, but the way that it does it is by localizing it to the individual, by saying, you know, this is the individual's responsibility, that like mental health is found within the individual, not as a product of society. And I feel like if this should be a common sense thing to sort of disagree with. But it seems like in my own experience, whenever I bring this up to people, there's like this immediate like defense for this idea that mental illness is something that's generated from within inside, and by doing so justifies a lot of practice, like the use of SSRIs, of going to therapists and whatnot. Like there's almost this justification that I find in like common people for the whole industry that's sprung up around mental health, which is probably an intended side effect, really, of this new system.
Yeah, well, I mean, Mark Fisher doesn't really go into this very much, but amongst the types of people that I think you're referring to or that I've had experience with, there's kind of this twin ideology around science, or like scientism as it's like sometimes referred to, like belief in that. And I feel like there's a reductionism to neuroscience and like the ability of these drugs to cure ailments that originate in biology in our genes, and that is the root cause of it, and that basically ideas around the social causation of mental illness get lumped in with every other claim that comes out of social construction, like, oh, you believe that, everything is a social construction, and that's kind of a fallacy that people like to jump on or something. They feel uncomfortable about the idea that everything is nurture over nature or something, but it's just a blatant fact that ADHD is, a new disorder that is increasingly, being ascribed to people. And how could you not feel as if that diagnosis as a historical fact relates to broader changes in the economy and the society? I feel like it's patently obvious.
Yeah. I mean, he touches on this a little bit. First, he'd like to, direct our attention to the fact that while neoliberalism proclaimed to be the force that finally put an end to bureaucracy, both in the government and in the private sector, what's really happened is a flattening of pyramid hierarchies and succumbing workers to increased surveillance. A theme he returns to both in the educational and healthcare practice is this idea of the audit. That is, that workers should question and reform their own experiences for increased productivity. He says the idealized market was supposed to provide friction-free exchanges in which the desires of consumers would be met directly without the need for intervention or mediation by regulatory industries. Yet the drive to assess the performance of workers to measure forms of labor, which by their nature are resistant to quantification, has inevitably required additional layers of management and bureaucracy. What we have is not a direct comparison of workers' performances or output, but a comparison between the audited representation of that performance and output. Inevitably, a short-circuiting occurs, and work becomes geared towards the generation and massaging of representations, rather than to the official goal of the work itself. Indeed, an anthropological study of the local government in Britain alleges more effort goes into ensuring that a local authority's services are represented correctly than goes into actually improving those services. This reversal of priorities is on the hallmarks of a system which can be characterized without hyperbole as market Stalinism.
Yeah. So it's like, I think it's related to the idea that the right always had a critique of state bureaucracy being an inefficient way to allocate resources and direct economic production, and that in the age of ushering in neoliberalism, with the drawback of the state, you would reduce bureaucracy. But as anyone who's ever had to, deal with getting healthcare through the Obama exchanges or filing a claim with their bank knows, there is a whole cornucopia of private bureaucracies that have sprung up. And whether it's in higher education or healthcare, there's, as Mark Fisher puts it somewhat, more abstractly, there's an idea that representation is in and of itself kind of what we're going for. This idea that we're cataloging everything, we're enumerating what we're doing, we're generating mountains of paperwork, and in doing that, we're creating some form of value, as if the paperwork itself is the ultimate end of what we're going to value. And he makes an equation, Mark Fisher does, with a kind of Stalinist project that was about building these canals to show the advancement of the Soviet state. But in the end, they didn't bother dredging the canals deep enough so that they could take large oil tankers. They just did massive photo ops around the canals to demonstrate the power and the legitimacy of the state. And that's basically what we're dealing with now with these bureaucracies, these forms of surveillance that generate large amounts of data about how much better maybe kids are doing in schools, what are your teacher recommendation metrics, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we're not really progressing on any social goals of, ending poverty, helping people with mental illness. Merely, we're just ticking off boxes saying, well, I did put this amount of work today into doing, that.
I think that's really well put. I think the crux of it is asking, what is the social responsibility that we have towards health, that we have towards mental health? And I think that this is a question that, activists and whatever researchers have been asking pharmaceutical companies, especially, as of late. I guess a few years ago, like Nan Golden, the photographer, went to NY-MoMA and poured a bunch of Xanax or Oxycontin into the pond in protest. I guess she was addicted to it after having some procedure done. I think that these prescriptions are this sort of stand-in for a more substantial social responsibility. It's appalling how at schools, especially young people, are going to their counselors and they're just being told that they need to go on this medication, and this medication. And that's just a way to launder your school's reputation, right? You say, yeah, we have receipts. We gave them these prescriptions. So if this kid, succumbs to their mental illness, we're not responsible.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well put. All of this talk about mental health had me kind of thinking about a moment that was interesting to me that I didn't realize I would find within the text. I think it's on page 18 where Mark Fisher goes pretty deep into Jacques Lacan, the famous person who kind of takes up psychoanalysis after Freud. And he talks about the distinction between reality and the real. So this is, very abstract, but basically the idea is that reality is, a figment of representation. We can never individually, through philosophy, through our, analytical retrospective minds, actually get at what is reality. Instead, we can only get short glimpses of the real, which is this kind of gaping void of what is actually happening out there with the entropy forces. And instead, in place of that, we have these pseudo realities that are painted to us, these ideologies or something. And he kind of points to these moments where you can, for a second, glimpse the real. You can look into the void. And one of those things is climate change. That is a glimpse into this, really abhorrent kind of nature that capitalism is creating. And I think that, perhaps we could call the mental health crisis another one of those moments where the realities, the fictions that are being put out by capitalist ideology give way for a moment, and you're able to glimpse the real, as Lacan would put it, in these kind of terrifying, social and natural phenomena.
Yeah, and he's saying that there's this politicization of the environment that's happening right now, something that's already being co-opted that we need to fight against. And I think at the end of the book, he kind of goes to this. he makes suggestions, that this new form of bureaucracy is something that needs to be fought, and there needs to be this politicization of mental health as well. And to me, what he's getting at is that there needs to be this sort of like new politics of the self. This new politics of like, how do we relate to bureaucracy? How do we oppose like unjust bureaucracies and unjust authorities above us? And how do we reconceptualize the social body? And he says at the end of the book, and I'm not sure personally how I feel about this. It's sort of a humanist notion for me, but he says that we need to return to a politics based around the general will. What do you guys think of that?
Well, okay, so what he's going for there, and he notes it in a few moments, and for this, you could almost consider him somewhat post-left, because he's looking for a new revolutionary subject, a new political subject, a new collectivity, I think, in place of the proletariat. Or maybe not in place of it, but a shift to it, a way in which we can, think about a change in our own subjectivity, our own conception of the self as it has been changed over the last 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, and how do we like marshal a idea of our own collective exploitation and alienation that, is very different than the idea that you loan out a piece of your body for an hourly wage as an appendage of an industrial machine. Like, it's very straightforward in classical accounts of, Marxism to talk about alienation in those terms, and those forms persist, but yet their kind of consequences are, in this day and age, largely more mental than they are physical. I guess would maybe be my thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, he says that, particularly as it relates to his classroom, that these carceral technologies that, discipline students into performing well are pretty much completely gone now, and there's these new forms of discipline, these new forms of control that have taken over more like classical forms of alienation, and that there needs to be new strategies to confront these.
Yeah. I mean, he talks a lot about how you still have like remnants of what Foucault described as like the way in which all these institutions in Fordist societies resembled a prison, and these were discipline, societies where the hospital and the schoolroom and the working on the line all resembled each other and all had a very similar logic to it. And yet those institutions, while they still have remnants of that, they don't enforce themselves with the same kind of paternalistic logic that they used to. They don't contort your body in the same way. He uses the kind of analogy to sitting in a classroom. It used to be that you had to sit up straight, and you'd get whacked on the knuckles if you didn't write perfectly in cursive and contort your body to show respect and deference to the teacher. But if you walk into a public school these days, you'll find nothing of the sort. People are much more casual in their appearance. There is a sorting that there, wasn't to the same degree in terms of cataloging students based on very early age testing and differentiating the student body from who is going to be the precarious laborers and who are going to be the, upper managerial class. And they don't have to enforce the same amount of discipline. They use a different, metric of power, which is about surveillance and control.
Yeah, there's certainly many discrete ways I think that this plays out in modern day. I think too, you mentioned the appendage and Marxism. I mean, we are alienated from our labor now in the sense too of just, constantly being used for data. Our very communications and social interaction is being extracted from us, and we have no control over it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, we're engaged in, kind of forms of labor even when we think we're just like socializing, because we're producing, data that is eventually monetized through ad revenue. So it really, doesn't have the same cut and dry boundaries that it once did, especially with the imperative of like always being online, always checking email, always being as responsive as possible. In the age of COVID, it's gotten to a even more intense peak with the use of surveillance technologies for remote workers to check what, screens they have open or something. And it's really, I mean, what it is, I think when you look at like the work of Deleuze and Guattari, it's about like how capitalism is this like, or not capitalism as much as, this disembodied figure of capital is, this fucking virus that's like invading the human subject and, really hollowing it out. And I think it is producing, I think what Deleuze and Guattari would say is like a schizophrenic subjectivity that, is really plastic and that is accustomed to a accelerated temporality. And that's the kind of subjectivity that needs to be reckoned with in order to build some sort of, new collective, socialist project. And I think that's what, Mark Fisher is ultimately trying to reckon with in this piece is like, how do you get these people who are suffering from way new kind of externalities of capitalism that we haven't seen before? How do we, catalyze them and understand that?
He is very much for this idea of just original thinking, not to sound cliche. And I found it to be really odd. I Googled Mark Fisher's name earlier on Reddit, and all of the things that showed up were talking about how he wasn't an original thinker, which I thought was kind of, it was funny because I was like, oh, maybe he would want to hear that because it just is like case in point capitalist realism.
Yeah. I mean, and he even says that in the book. He says that like basically all of this is just an extension of Frederick Jameson's The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism.
Yeah, and he's sort of inclined into the same thing that Jaishik does, where like all of his sort of case in point examples are movies, which I love. It cracks me up, It's like it's very good, especially from people who don't come from political backgrounds, to like really wrap themselves around these like big ideas by using films as analogies. But it's also just kind of this case in point of like there's no way to conceptualize new things anymore. So we have to conceptualize them through these kind of old signifiers, and through old mediums and through old slogans.
It's interesting that he still feels like there's some sort of like radical element to those with like such depressing takes on the whole culture industry, and yet he starts the book with Children of Men, which is a pretty mainstream movie. I mean, it's a pretty good, contemporary dystopian flick as far as they go.
Totally. Yeah, I always just feel a little bit, it's not a major criticism, but I always just feel like it's kind of a corny and a weak way to approach the subject.
I mean, there's the whole, like, to keep going down the film references, there was an interesting kind of moment where he's talking about the differences between Godfather and Goodfellas, and then the new
and Heat.
This kind of idea that these past films embodied they represented an authentic culture of Italian American immigrants who still had ties to tradition, and then like Heat is a movie that like is set in the landscape of LA, and like has no bearing in like history, no bearing in like culture or tradition, is like seems very like disembodied.
Yeah. I guess to
that's
kind of sum up
interesting.
it's really good and I really like it. I guess just to sum up my criticisms is Baudrillard was really against like the Deleuze sort of Foucault train of thought precisely because he feels as though our interpretation of history and our interpretation of documents um, we always take to be as like these honest representations of the time, but like simultaneously like in The Godfather or Goodfellas, these are always exaggerations. That's what Hollywood does. It always like exaggerates things, takes them to like their most extreme extent. I guess that's why I don't know, not to be nitpicky. I'm always just like sort of a little bit hesitant of like going to film or even to art as sort of like this eye into a generation and this eye into like an episteme.
That's certainly true. It's filtered through so many different like intermediaries when you think about it, when you think about like the teams producing music. I remember like the Suns may be dumb. The first time I learned that there were ghostwriters for some of my favorite musicians when I was younger was just like heartbreaking.
Yeah, totally blows up like the authenticity of the artist.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is funny, yeah. Elton John is a really big one who like writes none of his own music. It's all like a ghostwriter, which just blows up like the entire image or the representation of the artist, which is in and of itself was never true to begin with. But it just kind of like exposes this panel of just fiction that surrounds the author.
Yeah, yeah. Drake, another famous ghostwriting case, who I think later in his life, Mark Fisher kind of had an interest in Drake, funnily enough, because of just like how like depressing all of Drake's songs are. Of just like, you know, in the final instance, you're not asked to go along with like the fucking pop star on his like journey through like debauchery and partying. You're actually just supposed to like sympathize with their existential crisis around like not having like genuine human connections with like a woman and like not feeling like happy about like, you know, being famous. So it's like kind of the peak of, you know.
Well, yeah, it's funny because on the one hand, you could say it's just a kind of like classic boomer response to these lyrics, like, "Oh, I'm so offended by the debauchery," but he's
Yeah.
like post that,
And I feel that
he's like not offended.
yeah. No, I mean, yeah, there is a lot of I feel some boomer sentiments in what he says. So I wasn't aware that he had died by suicide too. Just the ultimate cynics way out.
Yeah, no, it's not really surprising though.
Yeah, R.I.P. He. Yeah, that is fucking crazy. I mean, I just can't imagine being like 50 and deciding then to
Yeah.
go out. I feel like I would kind of realize I want to go out like around like this age. Sorry. That's just a personal aside. Anyways.
No, I'm always interested in getting to the end of the road. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. The book is Capitalist Realism. Check it out. It's only 81 pages. Really great read. Thanks again.